So, welcome, folks. I'm so excited to be here with you for this conversation of an introduction to permaculture for environmental advocates. Something that I've noticed in my conversations with folks is that there are a lot of really great things happening in our area. And just in general, and when I say great things, I'm thinking specifically of great events happening to bring more environmental awareness and to work on ecosystem restoration. And what I notice is that there are a lot of people trying to do a lot of great things. And I do think that with a little bit more information, that it's possible to take some of those great projects and make them even a little bit better. Because one of the things that can happen is in our rush to make the environment better, sometimes if we do it without enough wisdom behind us, we can actually cause some unintended consequences. For example, if we decided to bulldoze a piece of land to plant a forest, there might be times where we'd want to do that, but we'd really want to know why we were doing it that particular way at this particular time. So I thought this intro to permaculture would be a great way that people who are trying to do good work can have a little more information and to do their work in ways that will get even better outcomes. So that's my hope. So we are going to fly through kind of quickly, since this isn't technically a class, more of a conversation starter. So this is just a pretty picture to get you excited about what I'm going to be talking about. This is in my garden. And one of the things that's really gets me excited is when we look at climate disruption and solutions to climate disruption, particularly in terms of trying to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, is if you look at the top 100 list in Project Drawdown, in the top 20 solutions, 12 of them are either land use or food production. So when we put those two together, when we use our land better to grow food, it's at least a triple bottom line. I mean, not only is the environment better, not only is carbon sequestered, but there's more food security. Our land spaces are going to be healthier ecosystems. There's going to be food for humans, there's food for animals, and pollinator habitat. So many exciting things happen. So we can really get a lot of yields out of our work when we just kind of tweak what we're doing and do it a little bit differently. And that's what I'm hoping to help with this conversation. So this is a representation of the ecological design process that I use, and it's not a linear process, but we have to have a way to flow through the conversation. So I'm going to start at the top with vision and take you through it again on a quick in a quick conversational way, since I'm not teaching you how to do everything in here today. So we're going to start out by talking about some terms, and you might hear me use the word permaculture sometimes, which is a contraction of the word permanent plus agriculture. That was a term that was coined in the 70s and 80s by a man named Bill Mollison, and it was a great start to thinking about how to bring human activities more in alignment with having a regenerative or sustainable environment around us. I have been trying to reclaim this word of permaculture by creating this definition to say that primarily permaculture is a design science. A lot of times people think of permaculture with food growing. It's so much more than that. It's primarily a design science, and it's based in learning from what native people did and looking around us at what nature does, and then acting like nature to improve ecosystems, to regenerate land spaces. And in the process, we are enhancing the quality of life for all beings. And that's plants, insects, humans, non-human animals, and fungi. I'm not attached to this term of permaculture. There's a lot of debate on terminology and how it gets used and where and when. We're talking about good work here. That's the most important thing. Ecological design, regenerative design, systems design, sustainable design. We can call it whatever we want to call it. Let's just do this good work in a good way. The three ethics of this design science of permaculture are earth care, people care, and resource share. And sometimes that third ethic of resource share is expressed as fair share or future care. So resource share is emphasizing sharing the abundance. Future care means that we're thinking about the generations that come after us. And fair share means that we're using what we need, and that way not consuming more than we actually need, which means that there will be more for everyone. I do want to honor the original stewards of this land that where I'm speaking to you from, the land that's now called Rochester, New York. And in particular, here we are in the traditional homelands of the Onondaga and the Seneca people. And also Cayuga, I should say. Thank you. There are many different lists of permaculture principles. I like Starhawk's because it's a little bit more fun, a little less wordy. So basically, these are principles that we use when we're doing design, whether it's designing a homestead, designing a garden, designing an economic system, designing how a city is organized. If we're using permaculture principles, these are the things we're doing. We are recognizing that everything is connected. We're trying to do more with less. We're trying to obtain a yield always. We're trying to maximize the yields that we get. And we do something that's called stack functions, which means we try to be very efficient. And you could think of this as the last time that you maybe went to the grocery store. You probably also might have stopped to mail something at the post office and picked up a book at the library. That would be stacking functions. One trip, three things that happen. The only principle that I really think about a lot, especially in 2020, is creatively use and respond to change, which is a principle that shows up on Holmgren's list. Again, there's no right or wrong list. It's really about the approach that we're using as we do this work. So when people talk about what permaculture is, a lot of times we think about these aspects of human shelter and our food production. It really is so much more. We can apply and use permaculture design to design our financial systems. For example, bartering time, like Ithaca dollars, doing the time banking trade systems. If we are using tools and technology, we might be working with what we call appropriate technology, which means we would only use fossil fuels for things that can only really be done very well by fossil fuels. Education, we could think of Waldorf schools or outdoor schools. So permaculture, again, can be used for any human system. So how we're organizing our lives and anything that we're designing. I really think about permaculture as how I do what I do every day. And that's really kind of the emphasis for this conversation, because I know there are a lot of folks who are trying to do good things for the environment. And while many of the actions that we're taking may be great, sometimes with just a little bit more thinking about it, we can do something that's even better. For example, buying trees from a local source than buying trees that are shipped in from the Midwest. Just one small example. When we are using permaculture design or ecological design, whatever name you want to call it. We're trying to create resilient systems. If you've ever had a one-legged stool, it's very tricky to balance and sit on. But if you have a three-legged stool, so much more stable. When we have diversity and redundancy and resiliency and dynamic stability, any three of those elements create this resilient system. So I should say diversity, redundancy, and dynamic stability makes a system more resilient. So even though permaculture is not just about how we grow our food, it's a great place to start since everybody eats. So I'm going to talk a little bit about permaculture through the lens of growing things. This is a great example. There's a YouTube video called Greening the Desert that I encourage you to watch if you ever want to get excited about how powerful these methods can be. On the left, you'll see the land in Jordan. It's a place where there's only like 1/10 of an inch of rain per year. Using permaculture techniques, starting out, there is a big piece of equipment there that is making a swale on contour, which adds to the surface area of the water that is held in this land space. And then using locally available materials, they mulch the swales. And everybody was surprised when 6 months later there were actually mushrooms growing there. Like, that's how much moisture they had brought into this very arid place. So I encourage you to check out that video. It's very inspiring. It's one of the things that got me excited and said, I have to know about permaculture. So now we'll briefly go through the process, the design process. It starts out with the vision. What is the dream that you have? This happens to be my place, the Rochester Permaculture Center, which is a suburban urban food forest that's been created on this creek forest suburban land edge. And that's my vision. Then we explore and find out what we know, who we know, what do we need to know, how are we going to go through this process. The next step would be to define goals. For example, today I want to introduce you to ecological design and talk about how we can use that to regenerate degraded ecosystems, improve habitat and food sources, create beautiful landscapes. How can we do this on small scale and on larger scale projects, like even municipal projects that are happening or we hope will happen in the area? And we'll talk a little bit about some methods and site considerations, and then have some time for questions. Hopefully you're all going to learn at least one thing today. During the site analysis, we look at what is. So if we were going out to a place and looking at it, we'd see what's there, what kind of trees, where the sun is, where it's wet, where it's dry, if there's buildings there, just to see all of the elements of what is there. We might also do a soil sample. And then we would move to the assessment phase and say, so what? There are things that we can change here. What can we change? How can we change it? And what makes sense to try to change? For example, changing where water flows is more difficult. There are ways to do it, but we're not usually going to like move a pond, for example. So in the site assessment phase, we try to bring out our creativity, our out-of-the-box thinking, and figure out what it is we think we can change that will help us meet our goals. Remember, everything is tied to those goals that we set. Goals indicate that they're the measure of our success. Then we would do a design. However, we would do that if we're going to do it on paper or go right out onto the land and mark things out. This is a design that I did for a project outside of Dansville. And then we implement the design, which in many cases means planting things. This is another design I did for Liberty Hill, which is the RIT President's Residence. And this is what it looked like after it was planted. Then our next step is to, after we've done the implementation, we want to celebrate. Make sure that we have a party and invite people. And this is a great opportunity to get some media attention for the project. It's also a great opportunity to kind of leapfrog onto the next project, because when people see what you've done someplace, then they get excited about what can happen in another place. Then we take a step back and evaluate. And when I say evaluate, what I mean is to look at what's happened and if we have reached our goals and what we need to do differently. We might want to adjust our goals. We might want to or need to do something a little bit different, to change something to bring us closer to our goals if there were some that weren't met. So we would take time to evaluate against our goals. And then pause. It's important to take a little rest. It helps us get a fresh perspective and get new ideas. So that very quickly is the ecological design process that I use when I'm working. And I use this all the time. I use this process actually to even design this presentation. I use it for work that I do with my clients. I use it for how I think about my life. I'm also going to briefly introduce you to edible forest gardening or food forest gardening. You've heard me talk about or use this phrase just a little bit. And what this is it's a consciously designed ecosystem that mimics the structure and the function of the temperate forest. It's gardening like the forest, not necessarily in the forest. And what we're doing is we're trying to intentionally create whatever our goals are. So this is one illustration to give you an idea about the structures of the forest. So you can see that there are actually 8 layers to the forest. This particular drawing, I haven't done my own drawing yet, but this drawing leaves out the fungal layer, which is essential. So we have canopy, low layer of trees, shrub layer. Then we have the herbaceous plants, the rhizomes, those are below the ground. We have the ground covers, the vertical climbers, the vines, and the fungi. Those are the 8 possible layers that we can put into any land space. This is what the forest does naturally. Naturally, if you go out and look in our forests here, you can, generally speaking, find all 8 of these layers. Here's an example of what it can look like when it's planted by human beings. And this slide illustrates why, one of the reasons why I'm such a huge fan of using this food forest model. You'll see, so this is a measurement of the net primary productivity, which basically means how many calories you can get out of a space of land based on the plants that are there and the sunlight. And we all know how rich in life and abundance things like estuaries and swamps and marshes are, the tropical rainforest. And if you look at this chart, you can see the temperate rainforest is the 4th most productive ecosystem in terms of net primary productivity. And this is our natural landscape here. Most of the land in our area, if it were left wild, would return to forest. So it's kind of a no-brainer to use food forest gardening here for that very reason, I think. So other reasons for food forest gardening is we can get really great yields of a diverse set of products, and I'll show you a list in a few minutes. It can become largely self-maintaining. It's a healthy ecosystem because it's based in perennial plants, and there's a lot of woody plants typically in a food forest. We have carbon sequestration. The carbon gets held in the plants, it gets held in the soil, and we're getting food at the very same time. Food for humans, food for pollinators, food for all of the critters in nature. So again, we can both solve this problem of too much carbon in the atmosphere and food insecurity at the same time. It's pretty simple to simply trade out some of our annual food production for perennial veggies and fruits and all of the various perennials that exist. Almost anything we grow as an annual is perennial somewhere. It's just that we're trying to grow them out of their hardiness zone, so they're annuals here. But this is a great example of some vegetables that are perennial that allows us to keep the carbon in the soil. So for example, you'll see some onions peeking up in kind of the lower left. Those are perennial onions. I'm pulling or cutting a couple of onions every year, but I'm doing this without having to replant every year because they will spread, and the carbon stays in the soil. Asparagus, there's also Turkish rocket, those are the yellow flowers in the background, that's a brassica, that's perennial. So if we're willing to eat a little bit differently, we can eat more perennial vegetables. We don't have to spend money on planting and buying things every year either this way. I also do grow no-till annuals, and I don't want to leave them out of the conversation. When we use no-till methods, again, we're not disturbing the soil, which could be an entire conversation about why that's so important. So there is room for annuals in what we're doing here. Here's that picture again. This is an example of how beautiful it can be as well. And this is an example of a polyculture. A polyculture simply being a collection of many plants. And each polyculture itself is a tiny food forest. So here we have a beach plum, and underneath it we have comfrey that's growing, and bee balm and red clover. And in the arbor that's in front of it, we have hardy kiwi and hops growing on it. So just that little section all by itself is a food forest. And then I put together a bunch of these polycultures so that I actually have, it's a little under 1/5 of an acre. And we can do this on any scale. We can do this on 5,000 acres, maybe different plants, but conceptually. I'll quickly take you through some of the progress that's happened in my little space in the not quite 10 years that I've been here. This was where I started the beds using sheet mulching and using the materials that were available on site, which again, I would consider to be a practice of permaculture. And then we put in some sustainably harvested black locust fence posts. Those posts will outlive me. And then I did a bunch of planting and sheet mulching and climbed up on my garage roof in the fall at the end of 6 months of working on it. And it's not very impressive from here. I call this my stick farm. If you were looking at it, it looked like a bunch of little sticks out there. But that's where things stood in late 2011. And then 3 years later, and you can see how it's grown and shifted over time very quickly. It becomes beautiful. This is something that I did out in the front of my house. Again, just using non-traditional landscaping plants to create landscape that's beautiful and edible and great pollinator habitat. And this particular polyculture is also selected to be tolerant of jugloan because there's 3 big walnut trees growing nearby. Remember I said about having a diverse food system, a diverse system comes from having a large number of different kinds of plants. This is just a small list of what I harvest from my garden every year. And a few more plants. I mean, everything from quince to alpine strawberries, Egyptian walking onions, fruit, vegetables, herbs, flowers. And this is an interesting version that I found in in the city of Rochester that I just thought was beautiful. So again, same techniques, just different places. This is an example of polyculture that is out at Camp Epworth. And if we were getting a food forest garden started somewhere where there are a lot of deer, we'd want to make sure that the plants are protected from the deer, which is one of the key elements of this particular image. Additionally, there's just a very rudimentary door that you can go into this little polyculture and maintain the space, harvest. And as I said, polyculture just basically means many plants. And generally speaking, we're using perennials. A perennial is any plant that lives at least 3 years, and some live as long as 3,000 years. We're trying to, in these polycultures, to have at least 3 functions, human functions: food, fiber, fun, pharmaceuticals, fuel, fertilizer. And we're also trying to fill these various niches in architecture and in time and in succession, meaning that there's food now and there's food later, because when we plant things, they don't stop growing, right? I mean, unless they die. So these polycultures will evolve and change over time. The goal is to create a system of self-renewing fertility so that we don't have to do a lot of work to keep this new ecosystem functioning really well. And compost is an example of self-renewing fertility, where you put food scraps in and nature does its magic. And when you are at the end of the process, you pretty much have soil again, except soil that's very rich in a lot of elements and things that plants need. And again, composting could be its own class. We might also purposely cultivate or allow or make space for weeds. What is the definition of a weed? Usually it's just a plant that's growing in a place where somebody doesn't want it. There are some plants that are truly problematic. Something like giant hogweed is problematic for humans. But overall, there are a lot of weeds that we can eat. So we can just let nature do what it's already doing and have food for ourselves and also food for nature. Dandelions, for example, are incredible pollinator food source. And, we have so many people who are trying to get them out of their lawns, but they're really one of the first flowers. So besides being all parts of them being edible and nutritious for humans, they're a terrific pollinator food source. When we are creating these polycultures, again, we're doing things a little bit differently. So this is one of those key leverage points where we can pretty much always plant something somewhere. We could take a shovel and a tree and go put it in the middle of the field. Now, does that mean it's going to succeed there? Maybe yes, maybe no. Is it in the right conditions? And this is one of the places where a permaculture approach can be significantly different from how mainstream landscaping is done. Because we really want to put a lot of emphasis on making sure that we're putting the right plants in the right place at the right time. So if we already have a shady yard and we want to keep some sunlight for growing some tomatoes, we probably don't want to plant another shade tree where it's going to grow up and block the sun for those tomatoes. But maybe we're thinking way down the road and we're going to do, container gardening in the driveway down the road. So the shade tree wouldn't be tall enough to create shade in that other spot for 10 years. So maybe you do plant it now, or maybe you wait a couple of years and plant the big tree. Anyway, right plant in the right place at the right time. And when we do that, we're looking at things like the hardiness zone. Is a plant going to be successful based on the hardiness zone that we have? And remember, right now, as the climate is warming, overall, we're seeing the hardiness zone shift, which means that different plants will be successful in places that they haven't before. And some plants that we consider native, there may be a point where they're no longer able to grow where they had been native. This is something that's been happening, all through the Earth's history. Anyway, so other considerations that we would use when we're thinking about what we're planting and where and why, we would look at the sun and shade, we'd look at the water amounts and the patterns, where does it flow, when does it come down. You might not want to plant shrubs next to the side of your driveway, for example, because the snow in the winter, or the water in the wintertime is snow. And then if you're plowing or shoveling the snow, you might stack it up alongside of the driveway right on those shrubs, and then they're going to get broken and not make it. So that's an example of how we have to think holistically. Think about what the water is like all year long, not just in the summer. We're also going to look at things like the soil pH and texture and other aspects of the soil, native habitats, for the species that we're using there. What are the human yields that we're trying to get? What ecosystem function contributions are we getting? That means things like pollinator habitat. We are also planting in these niches that I've already talked about. So this way of designing and implementing is one of the ways that sometimes permaculture really stands out from mainstream landscaping practices. This is a map of the hardiness zones. Generally speaking, in our area, we're in 5 or 6. And as I mentioned, that's shifting. With the sun and shade analysis, we are looking, and we also want to think about seasonal variations too. Remember, if you look out now, all those deciduous trees that are bare will have leaves on them. So that means that there's going to be shade around those trees, depending on the time of day, but on the north side or the east side or the west side of those trees, there will be shade, probably from the end of April until the end of October. We talked a little bit about the water patterns. We want to look at all forms of water and what we can change. Sometimes, if there's a place where there's a little, I have water that flows down my driveway. And so I've been working on creating a rain garden to help kind of shift where the water flows and where it goes and to slow it down a little bit. Looking at that soil pH and texture, we could do a soil sample and do a test. We can also look at indicator plants. For example, plantain and dock tell us that the soil is acidified. And similarly, there are other plants that grow in other situations. Some of the plants that we think of as weeds are actually what I would call pioneer plants. They are plants that come in after a place has been disturbed, either by digging or erosion or wildfire. And they're some of the first plants to grow. And that is an amazing thing. Thank goodness, because if they didn't, the soil would erode and degrade even more. And those pioneer plants then are actually building the soil health for the plants that will come after them. So we need to think about that as we think about weeds. When we're creating habitat, we want to think about whether that space would, if we did nothing to it, would it be forest? Would it be a meadow? Is it a floodplain? Looking at those various possibilities. And I really like this list of human yields. It's kind of fun. Sometimes when I'm practiced up, I can just rip them right off. Dave Jackie calls them the 7 Fs: food, fiber, fodder, fuel, pharmaceuticals, fertilizer, and fun. pharmaceuticals being the plant method. So these are yields that we might try to get out of an ecosystem to help support human life. Then there are the ecosystem functions that support the rest of life in addition to human animals. So we need to have nitrogen fixing plants. We need to have nutrient accumulating plants that draw the minerals up from deep in the bedrock into the upper layers of the soil for the plants to use them. We also want to create wildlife shelter and food, invertebrate shelter. We want to create nectaries for particular insects sometimes. And that can include honeybees, which are not native pollinators. There are a lot of other pollinators too. And remember that 95% of insects are beneficial. So a lot of times if we can attract the useful, beneficial insects, they'll help us manage some of the pests and diseases that come in when they're not there to help control them. We can also have the function of ground cover, holding the soil. Aromatic pest confusers are a way of detracting critters from things we don't want them to eat. So for example, planting planting daffodils around your lettuce patch will help keep the woodchucks out. And coppicing is a way that we can use the sprouts on stumps for animal fodder if you're feeding goats or want some wattle and daub fencing. We can use coppice, which is another ecosystem function that we get from plants. I've talked about the niches in space and architecture. We want to think about above ground and below ground as we're selecting the plants. And this idea of succession. And if we're planting for a public project, we're really looking over a longer stretch. We're surrounded by Olmsted parks that were planted over 100 years ago. If we're talking about our own garden, we want to make sure that we have food in the near term. Yes, we can grow food in shade. So whether we're doing this in our home environment, or if we're working on a project somewhere, reclaiming a brownfield or some other ecosystem restoration project, even if it's shaded, there are plenty of food producing plants that we can grow there. And even under walnuts. I actually have a list, thanks to Dave, Jackie, and Eric Tonesmeyer, of 56 plants that are jug loan tolerant and food producing. And that's what I'm growing in this section. And I need to get a new picture because it looks much bigger and nicer than this now. We can even use these polycultures and create certain polycultures to tame the wild energy. So if you want to keep animals or humans out of a space, thorns are a really great option. So if we plant something that's thorny, we can grow what's sometimes called a fedge, which is a combination of a fence and a hedge. And that will help mitigate this wild energy damage, wild energy being anything that we don't control, which is a lot. So again, we can use thorns, and then we can use these aromatic pest confusers, things that are kind of smelly, and that will keep wildlife out if that's what we want to do. There are lots of options of for polycultures that will grow in wet soils. And one of my favorite wet soil plants is elderberry, because it also grows in dry soil. So they're very resilient. If we have dry, warm soils, again, there are other sets of plants that we would select for that space. So this is what I mean about putting the right plant in the right place. You don't want to put something that needs a lot of water in a place that's dry, unless it's something that's weedy and you don't want it to be super prolific. We can also use edible plants to replace some plants that have become conventional. For example, a common landscaping plant is a burning bush, which is not only not native, it's invasive. It does have beautiful red foliage in the fall, but as you can see down here, so do blueberries. Blueberries are just as brilliant. And I can say that in my experience, because I have a neighbor who has a burning bush, and I can stand in front of my blueberries and see the burning bush at the same time, and they're both the same color red. The only difference is that the blueberries are feeding me and the birds, and you know, they're not invasive. We do have to be patient sometimes when we do this work. Beauty doesn't always happen in the first year or the second year. There's a saying about perennials that the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. So sometimes when we're doing these projects in a beautiful way, in a way that's beautiful environmentally, it may not look beautiful right away. Depending on the project and the funding, sometimes you have to start with little baby trees that are a foot tall, and there isn't money to buy a 15-foot tall tree. But that's okay. Like we have time. It's just getting the project started. That's the really important thing to do, I think. These are some fun examples from a project in Todmorden, England, where they have worked on growing food everywhere. And this food is public food. So anybody can come and pick and eat this food that grows at the train station or in this car in the center square. So there are so many options for how we grow food and how we integrate it into our environment, whether it's into our built environment or into spaces that still are, I don't want to say, I don't like the word undeveloped, but places where we haven't put buildings and other structures are a great opportunity for doing this kind of work. I do host a meetup group. If you want to join that, it's another way to learn more about permaculture. It's been a little bit of a struggle in 2020 to figure out how to interact in ways that are meaningful and safe at the same time. So I encourage you to have patience, but that's also where I announce most of the projects and events that I am involved in that are open to the public. And we're lucky to have the Permaculture Association of the Northeast. Full disclosure, I am the board treasurer, but this is a great organization. They do educational events and newsletter and other things so that you can connect with other folks who are kind of interested in these topics. So these are our goals for today. And as we're getting ready to wrap up in terms of the presentation, excuse me, I'm modeling what I taught you about doing the evaluation, evaluating what we did versus the goals that we had. So I wanted to introduce you a little bit to the concept of permaculture, ecological design, a little bit about the process, the thinking that makes it different from just deciding, oh, wouldn't this burning bush look beautiful out in the middle of the yard somewhere? We're going to choose plants a little bit differently, and we're going to install them a little bit differently. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't use appropriate technology, which could include fossil fuel powered equipment. But if we did so, we would want to do that with our eyes wide open and to make sure that was our best option. Hopefully you also learned a little bit about how we can use these ecological design methods to regenerate degraded ecosystems, improve the habitat, create more food sources for humans, for all of nature, while also creating landscapes that are beautiful. And I hope that the examples were helpful to you and that you've learned at least one thing. And we are, as I mentioned, this is a recorded conversation. There will be some folks who couldn't make it who are interested today. If you have questions, you can reach me at this email. if you found value and learned something from the presentation today and wanted to make a contribution for the learning that you've hopefully experienced, there's my PayPal link, and you're welcome to reach out to me at any time. I do consult, design, speak, teach, and I'm glad to help this good work happen in any way that I can. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording and then we can go on to questions. Thank you so much.